Okay, now I would like to call Doug Caul, Deputy Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, to the stage, and Cheryl Casimer from Tanaha First Nation, representing the First Nations Summit Political Executive. Would you come to the stage, please? As they're coming to the stage, I'd like to acknowledge guests who are with us today. The former Attorney General Suzanne Anton is here with us today. Laurie Ackerman, the Mayor of Fort St. John. Senator Lillian Dick, the Senate Standing Committee on Indigenous Peoples of Saskatchewan. And Jody Wilson-Raybould, MP for Vancouver-Granville. I'd also like to add that we have in the audience today Jesse McCormick, who is the Director of Rights and Limitation from the Ministry of Justice and Attorney General of Canada.
Well, good morning, everybody. I have to admit there was a little fear struck in my heart when I thought you were calling me up to do the welcome song, Mark. I don't know what you, Cheryl, you probably could have pulled it off, but I guarantee you I could not have. Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I am Doug Caul. I'm the Deputy Minister for the Ministry of Indigenous Relations, and I'm here on behalf of the Honourable Scott Fraser, who's unavailable, but certainly sends his greetings and wishes he could have been here. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you this morning to talk. And I want to start by acknowledging the territories that the Musqueams live to, the Squamish peoples, and thank them for allowing us to do the important work that we do here and to live and work and play in these beautiful territories. I want to acknowledge Dennis as well for the greeting this morning and the welcoming. And of course, Bella, who just did the welcoming song for us. What an amazing job that is. And you know, as we go throughout the day, I hope you'll remember Bella. And I hope you'll remember her face, and I hope you'll remember the spirit that she put into that song, because that's a lot of why we're here. That's a lot of why we've done the work that we've done, and why government has taken the step that it has in partnership with First Nations and Indigenous peoples in British Columbia to make sure that we bring the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into force in British Columbia. And of course, I'm grateful to have Cheryl here with me as well to talk about the work that we've done together, and it has been together. It's been quite a journey that both of us can reflect upon over the past year, and it's been a unique partnership about how we build legislation together. Bill 41, as it was known then, was introduced in the House in October. That was after, as I said, a year of work. And I know Cheryl's going to talk a little bit about what brought us to that place, but I can tell you it had numerous experts, Indigenous experts and government experts working together. As I said, it was really a unique experience. I've been involved in legislation a number of times in my career in different roles in government, and the ability to sit down and do this together with Indigenous voices, Indigenous leaders at the table, building it together was definitely unique and is a huge part of the success of this. And it's the kind of partnership and legislation that's unprecedented. I know I haven't experienced this before, and it's probably unprecedented in Canada as well. It's a tangible example of how we are truly building that new relationship with Indigenous peoples in British Columbia, one based on respect and recognition of the inherent rights. Once the bill was in the House, it had almost 24 hours. I think it was 23 hours. Somebody actually counted it in my office, and they told me it was 23 hours and some odd minutes of debate in the legislature. Another unique experience for me. For those of you who actually sit and watch the legislative channel, you'll see that staff people like me get a chance to sit in the House with the minister and assist with answering the questions and I've done that before, but to do it in this way and to go through the details that we went through, not only in the bill, but 40 or 41 of the 46 articles of the UN Declaration was unique in itself. As much as it might be challenging for anybody to sit and read the answer and to watch the videos, if you get a chance, it's actually worthwhile. It was a very, very detailed question and answer session, and it was noted by a number of political pundits and media and by others in the political world that it was probably one of the most constructive debates that they've ever witnessed. And I think that I know that that's something that the minister is extremely proud of. And in the end of November, Bill 41 was passed into law unanimously by all members of the legislature. What stood out for me was the widespread support for the legislation. Its historic legislation is essential for laying the foundation for a stronger, more inclusive British Columbia. One that will create better opportunities for everyone. And I'm grateful for events like this that talk about the legislation and to help to bring forward the understanding and make sure that there's that realization and acceptance of it across the province. And with that, I'd like to actually show you a short video right now. I think it's being queued up.
Before, how we would actually work to do business together was really undefined.
We've seen battles in the courts, we've seen protests because there wasn't proper consultation, because there wasn't proper consent.
And now we want to see a change, we want to see a reset.
This legislation is one more step to be able to build trust-based relationships where Indigenous peoples are respected,
where we are holding each other up and benefiting equally.
And this province will succeed in economic development from having Indigenous peoples at the table.
It's going to lead to a lot more prosperity for all of us in a good way.
We're doing things the right way for the first time, and there's going to be positive changes.
Now is the time to be on the right side of history. We want to live in a relationship where we're working together, making decisions together. And I do believe that if that happens, then we will see a brighter future.
So past relationships between government and First Nations have far too long been clouded by uncertainty. Those are relationships that unfortunately were quick to erode and too often ended up in court. That was really the only recourse for First Nations to protect their constitutional rights. That was through litigation. And time again, courts have been clear about the rights of Indigenous peoples and their territories. And time again, if you look at the legislation, the trajectory over the last 25 years, the courts have been very clear. They've been encouraging governments and Indigenous partners to move on reconciliation outside of the court process. The legislation gives us the tool to break that cycle. Instead of uncertainty and lawsuits, we can build a robust, sustainable economy by working together. We can create opportunities for Indigenous peoples, all British Columbia families, businesses, industry, and communities. We can all prosper. As former Attorney General Jeff Plant, and I think I heard he was in the room here today, said, properly implemented, the UN Declaration offers an opportunity to replace the conflict on the land with cooperation and to make real progress towards reconciliation. That's what this legislation does. It'll in turn give us clarity and transparency, all of us, business, communities, all British Columbians, Indigenous peoples. So what does the legislation do? It provides that framework for the steps that we're going to move forward on reconciliation. It mandates the government to bring provincial laws into harmony with the UN Declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples. We'll work together with our Indigenous partners on an action plan to achieve the objectives under the legislation. And we'll report annually in order to monitor that progress. The action plan and the annual reporting provide the transparency and accountability for the work ahead. In addition to these core elements, the legislation gives government more flexibility with our Indigenous partners to enter into agreements with a broader range of Indigenous governments. And it also provides that discretion for new decision-making agreements with Indigenous governments where decisions directly affect those people. What the legislation doesn't do, and unfortunately this is something we have to reinforce over and over again, is it doesn't create new rights. Those rights exist. It's been well known, it's been documented in court decisions time and time again that the Indigenous rights are already recognized in the Constitution through Section 35. There are rights that the courts have consistently upheld. It also doesn't give Indigenous people the veto, or give veto. The word veto does not appear anywhere in the 46 articles of the Declaration. Free, prior, and informed consent is about engaging with Indigenous peoples in proposed activities in those areas from the beginning in a deep, meaningful way. The legislation reflects government's acknowledgement there are some decisions that must be made with Indigenous peoples. The legislation gives the tools to implement a structured, transparent, accountable process for decision making along the way. Drafting and passing the legislation has definitely been quite the journey, and it's been a major accomplishment, but the hard work is now ahead. There are many things that we have yet to discover, and many questions that will take time to answer. But the good news is not new to us. It's not new to many of you in this room. We've been moving down this path for many, many years. British Columbia government, Indigenous peoples, communities, and business alike. Many companies, many of you, have already embraced the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And many of you have built, in business community, have built that strong collaborative relationship with your Indigenous partners. And we'll hear from some of you later today. What I've observed in British Columbia, and I believe firmly, is that we're leaders. We're leaders in Canada on reconciliation. It hasn't always been easy, and it won't be easy going forward. We have stumbled, and we will continue to stumble. We will continue to make mistakes, and we will continue to learn from each other. But we are a leader, and I hope that all of you will recognize that and continue to be those leaders that we are in Canada. The work ahead now is to align the laws and develop that action plan. And we'll do that in close cooperation and consultation with Indigenous peoples. We'll soon start the discussions with the First Nations Leadership Council that Cheryl's part of, First Nations and Indigenous organizations. The government is also committed to transparency. We'll be working with and maintaining communication with communities as well as business. Given how far we've come together, I'm confident that we can do this. I'll pass the floor now to Cheryl, but I want to say a couple of personal words about Cheryl. I was proud to watch Cheryl and her leadership colleagues were able to stand in the legislature and speak to the House about the monumental event that was happening when the bill was introduced. And I'm incredibly grateful for the partnership that Cheryl has shown throughout the journey that we've gone on together, and I can't think of a better partner to move forward with together as we move forward to implement the bill. So thank you. And over to you, Cheryl.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start off by acknowledging the traditional unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And I'd like to acknowledge Dennis Thomas for providing us with the traditional welcome. And I'd also like to acknowledge Bella Stark for the Women's Warrior song that she shared with us this morning to help us get started in a good way, to ground us in what I think is really important in terms of our culture. I just wanted to share a little bit about Bella that I learned in the back. She's 12. She's been drumming now for a couple of years, and she's taken a lead role in terms of teaching and sharing songs and culture within her nation. And so I really wanted to hold her up and acknowledge her for this, for the leadership that she's taken at such a young age. I also want to put you on notice that I may at times repeat some of what Doug Caul has already mentioned. Not because I want to, but because, I I have to admit that I'm not quite as prepared as I typically am when I'm asked to speak, given that I was asked to do this yesterday. So there was supposed to be somebody else in my place here, but everybody's sick, and so I'm stepping in, so you're stuck with me. I want to share with you a little bit about the context, and I'm sure that most of you are all familiar with it, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but I think everybody's aware that the Indigenous-Crown relationship has undergone many dynamics since contact, ranging from early military alliances and treaty making to colonization and attempted assimilation through policies of denial, such as the doctrines of discovery and terra nullius. The attempts by the Crown to dispossess Indigenous peoples of their lands and resources and to assimilate them through various policies led to significant conflict. Once Indigenous peoples had access to the legal system, our nations began using colonial courts to seek compensation, restitution, and recognition and protection of our rights. Much of this litigation arose after Aboriginal and treaty rights were recognized and affirmed under Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982. And most of this litigation arose out of British Columbia, where there are a few treaties where the courts confirm that rights, including Aboriginal title and self-government, exist, and the Crown has corresponding obligations. While we expected significant shifts in government policies after each of these cases, we did not see the transformative change required for meaningful reconciliation. After the Supreme Court of Canada declared Aboriginal title in Silcotin, the chiefs in BC took it upon themselves to articulate 4 principles arising out of the case law that would guide effective relationships and reconciliation. And this work was done under the leadership of the then regional chief, the Honorable Jody Wilson-Raybould. Those 4 principles are, number 1, acknowledgement that all our relationships are based on recognition and implementation of the existence of Indigenous peoples' inherent title and rights, and pre-Confederation, historic, and modern treaties throughout British Columbia. Number 2, acknowledgement that Indigenous systems of governance and laws are essential to the regulation of lands and resources throughout British Columbia. 3, acknowledgement of the mutual responsibility that all of our government systems shall shift to relationships, negotiations, and agreements based on recognition. And 4, we immediately must move to consent-based decision-making and title-based fiscal relations, including revenue sharing, in our relationships, negotiations, and agreements. While the government largely ignored the 4 principles at first, they did find their way into what became the Joint Commitment Document, endorsed by the BC Cabinet and First Nations Leadership Council. The commitment document, along with its joint agenda, setting out a shared vision, guiding principles, and concrete actions, is now our shared roadmap to systemic shifts supporting reconciliation. We developed the commitment document to reflect key legal principles in Canadian jurisprudence, as well as consistent recommendations made in numerous reports, such as the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report and the more recent Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, and of course the United Nations Declaration. The BC government also borrowed from Canada's playbook and adopted its own 10 principles respecting the government of British Columbia's relationship with Indigenous peoples to signal a shift within the civil service and how they interact and conduct business with First Nations. And in the 2019 BC Throne Speech, the government committed very publicly its intention to see through its commitment to developing provincial legislation on the United Nations Declaration. The United Nations Declaration is about our human rights in an Indigenous context. The inherent right of self-determination is a key thread throughout the United Nations Declaration and also Section 35 protected rights in Canada. Indigenous peoples are title and rights holders and are decision makers with inherent jurisdiction. Recognition of this must be the basis of meaningfully addressing 150 years of colonialism and achieving reconciliation. The United Nations Declaration legislation further supports a shift to relations between the Crown Government and proper title and right holders on a government-to-government basis. This legislation is a key step in our broad commitment to jointly design, construct, and implement a principled pragmatic, and organized approach to reconciliation in British Columbia. Bill 41 represents a significant part of the transformation needed for a modernized Crown-Indigenous relationship in BC. It builds from our concrete actions in the commitment document, where we undertook to review laws, policies, and practices in priority areas such as children and families, environmental assessment, forestry, and land use planning. The legislation will therefore be another significant tool for us to use collectively in our principled, organized, and joint approaches to reconciliation. Going forward, we'll be actively engaging with Indigenous leaders on how to prepare the action plan and what should be included in the action plan. This is a discussion that we have been waiting to have for far too long, and this discussion needs to be led by Indigenous peoples. We must give guidance to the bureaucracy through adjusted laws, policies, and practice direction so that they have new laws and policies to direct how they work and new tools to work with Indigenous nations. This means that there is much work for us to do. We need to identify potential legislative, policy, and practice changes needed to better serve our Indigenous children, families, and communities, and to find preventative approaches that reduce the crippling effects of poverty. We are scheduled to come together, the province of British Columbia and the First Nations Leadership Council, on January 24th to begin that conversation. This is what the United Nations Declaration is all about, taking measured steps to uphold basic human rights that ensure the health and success of our citizens. Many of the articles in the Declaration speak of very fundamental basic human needs, such as the right to culture and identity, to be free from violence and oppression, and to have opportunities just like any other person in society. We all want what's best for our communities. We want our people to be healthy, successful, and a part of the political, social, and cultural and economic fabric of this province and this country. We are in a new year and a new decade. The foundation has been set for us. We have the responsibility now to maximize the opportunities that lie before us. Our people are counting on us to get this work done, and our people are counting on us to get this work done right. I believe that the world is watching. Thank you.
To start us off here, I want to thank you both for making your comments. I just had a question to start us off while you're queuing up your apps to the Deputy Minister. You had mentioned that British Columbia is first in Canada to move forward with this legislation. Do you see Canada or British Columbia influencing heavily how the federal government will go in the reintroduction of this legislation in the coming term?
The answer to that is, I don't know. We're having conversations, had conversations with officials from the federal government who come up and been very curious with us. I'm sure your team is doing the same thing about how we do this, who we involved, what the process was, and obviously what the content of the legislation. So that's the stage that we're at right now. I know that my minister's spoken publicly that he's encouraged by the messages he's hearing from the federal government. So, we're prepared to help and willing to provide that advice and guidance, recognizing that British Columbia is one jurisdiction amongst many, and it's very complex as we try to work this across Canada. But we'll do what we can to assist them for sure.
Thank you for the question, Mark. And I just wanted to add that in the mandate letters for Ministers Bennett and Minister Miller, they have been instructed to work on developing and implementing legislation around the United Nations Declaration. And at the last Assembly of First Nations meeting that was held in December, BC leadership made it very clear to both ministers that we want to have a key role and play a key role in terms of the development of that legislation. we don't want something to be developed that is going to contradict or to negatively impact the work that we've already undertaken here in British Columbia. And so we're looking forward to the opportunity when we are able to sit down and have a conversation, a more detailed conversation about what that's going to look like. But it's really important for us to make sure that we are at that table.
This conference right now is organized very much from a commercial perspective. There are commercial interests in the room. UNDRIP itself, the legislation, can you hear me? Sorry, okay. The legislation right now is put in by government and is a new relationship with Indigenous people. What role does business play to help UNDRIP along? UNDRIP itself doesn't apply specifically to businesses, although it impacts businesses. Can you speak to that?
So, as I said in my presentation, the government is very committed to transparency with working with businesses and industry as well as all the governments. We were able to have a number of conversations with the business community over the past year and a half. Yes, we've had a number of discussions with business companies, with business associations, and we'll continue to do that. Transparency is very, very key to the next steps. So, as we go, for instance, as we go forward through Section 3 on the alignment of the laws piece, it's a legislation that's regarding forestry or it's regarding mining or whatever it may be, decisions yet to be made. We work very closely with those sectors to make sure that they're aware of what we're up to and make sure that they have a chance to give make sure their voices are heard as well. Part of the unique aspect of what we've been able to do here, building legislation, is that we've had those experiences where it's been us and First Nation people sitting side by side. So it's not just the government who's out there talking to industry associations, but we have our Indigenous partners sitting side by side with us, having those discussions with business and industry as well. So I anticipate we'll do more of that.
I'm going to pose the questions that are coming in. They're at the top of the screen there, and number one question right now is, how does the government navigate the relationship between hereditary and elected leaders?
I think we've been actually navigating this for quite some time. It's a challenge, that's for sure. But an important part of self-determination from our perspective is that, from the government's perspective, is that communities need to rediscover these things for themselves. And there's a lot of work going on in communities. I know of many agreements that people in my office have negotiated on behalf of government and have been doing so for years. Not just with the recent government, but definitely for years, where the communities have come together and been able to have elected and hereditaries supporting something in whatever that area is that we form. So I think we've been navigating for quite some time, but it's really driven by the communities. They're the ones who tell us and help us learn and understand the structures, who has what responsibilities, and make sure that we're respecting that.
One of the concepts that's core in UNDRIP, the declaration, is FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. As you can see, one of the questions of great interest to the audience is, who defines consent?
Consent, as I said, is, and if you actually go back and you look at some of the papers and the guidance that we've got from the United Nations themselves, free, prior, and informed consent is a process. It's a transparent process of working with each other and trying to understand each other's perspectives, going into a deeper level of discussion than we've had before. It's definitely not checking the box. And the idea is, at the end of the day, you want to be able to come out the other side with a better understanding and mutual understanding and hopefully mutual agreement. It doesn't mean there's always going to be that agreement, but that is something that we're definitely striving for. As I said, and I know my minister said it a number of times when he was in the legislature, and the Premier said it, and I believe I've heard a number of Indigenous leaders as well say it. It doesn't mean veto, but it is about making Indigenous nations and the government working together and trying to have that deeper level of understanding and make sure that we can offer something
to support it.
All right, thank you. There are many questions. We won't have time for all of them on the stage now. I'd like to thank our speakers and for sharing your comments and setting us off in our discussion today. Thank you very much.